Hello, thank you for joining us today for the first of our 3 training sessions for EarthX 21. We're really excited that you're able to join us today. We've got a great webinar for you. Our first theme this year is on community fire resilience. Our facilitator to today is my partner in crime for developing the EarthX series, Mr. Ranger Doran. Ranger, I'll turn it over to you for introductory remarks and to start your facilitation.
All right, thank you, John. As mentioned, I am Ranger Doran. I'm the exercise coordinator for the EIS Council. I'm a retired firefighter from California and a former National Incident Management Team member. So I've had a life of fighting fire across the West. I don't know if you noticed in the news lately, but fire is there. There's record drought across the Western United States. We have record level fires. 2020 was a record level, and now in 2021, we're already at double where we were in 2020, with several major fires burning right now, if you've been watching the news. We also find this to be an international issue. There were 2 fires in April that burned about a third of Killarney National Park in Ireland, and everybody watched last year's Australian bushfire season, was come to be known as Black Summer. Why should you be concerned? Well, if you live, work, or travel through an area with trees and brush and bushes, there's potential for you. If your supply chain passes through areas of this type of vegetation, disruptions can occur. If your power grid passes through areas like this and forests, there is potential. So altogether, we see this as something that all of us should pay attention to with climate change. So we brought together a number of experienced emergency managers from local, county, and state level government, as well as from both coasts, to give you some perspectives. First, I would like to welcome up Mr. Robert Lewin. He's a principal at Resolute Associates and a former EOC director for the County of Santa Barbara, California. Robert?
Thank you very much, Ranger. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. We live in a time of climate extremes, and while we always had destructive major fires, the regime we are now faced with has left seasoned fire commanders and emergency managers confronted with challenges that we did not or could not expect. Next slide. When the Thomas Fire burned, it became the largest fire on record in California, and it burned in December when the daylight hours are the shortest and conditions should be cool and wet. It burned during the driest fall on record after 7 years of drought. The first rain would finally come on January 9th, and it would be a 200-year rain event that would cause a disaster in the Tony community of Montecito. Next slide. On the first day of the 4th of 2017, as it burned in Ventura County to the south, it would burn 1,000 homes and damage the power grid, knocking out the power to Santa Barbara County. Hospitals, dispatch centers, and the EOC were all out of power as generators failed from surges. Next slide. The fire would kill a firefighter and a civilian and burn all through the month of December into January. Next slide. It was not only a record-breaking fire in size at 282,000 acres, it also broke the record for the largest number of firefighters, more than 8,500 on one fire. Next slide. The fire decimated the watershed that provides critical water supply to an area where the main reservoir was already at 7% capacity. Next slide. Ash and smoke were so bad that we distributed 850,000 N95 masks. Next slide. While the fire was still raging, some of us recognized the likelihood that the next disaster could be a deadly mud and debris flow. At the time, the fire was wiping out 13 miles of watershed in the front country in 17 named canyons above Carpentry and Montecito. The county cleared all 11 debris basins above the communities in preparation for a storm event. This would prove to be an action that would save countless lives. It was Christmas time. People were tired from the fire. The weather was beautiful, and now we had to wake up everyone to the fact that a clear and present danger was sitting on the mountains above them. Next slide. First, we had to explain what a debris flow is. Next slide. That it occurs when you have a high-intensity fire on steep mountains, on soils that will mobilize. Then all you need is a high-intensity burst of rainfall. Next slide. That the rain striking the steep mountains will create rills. Next slide. The water with ash, mud, limbs, and rocks in the rills will create a concrete-like slurry in the gullies and creeks as it moves down the mountains at 40 miles per hour. Next slide. We had no map yet, as the scientists had just begun their work, so we developed a map with our GIS team, figuring mud could not stand up more than 20 feet. Next slide. We engaged our fellow emergency response leaders and held numerous planning meetings as far back as December 21st while the fire was still active. We developed messaging about the potential for debris flow and alerted the public. Next slide. We held press conferences 4 days before the 1/9 storm where scientists from the National Weather Service, U.S. Forest Service, and CAL FIRE spoke of the threat to life and property. I stated that, quote, dry creeks will become raging rivers of mud and debris, roads will be lost, and it could be deadly. Next slide. As if on cue, the storm developed and strengthened each day as it made its way toward Santa Barbara. We held leadership strategy meetings and made decisions. 30 hours before, we executed our evacuation plans and ordered in 150 firefighters and law enforcement. The National Guard high clearance vehicles were staged, helicopters on standby, and we activated our emergency operations center. We were ready to go. Never before had such actions been taken in Santa Barbara County for a flood warning. And of course, the storm arrived in the dark of night while people were sleeping. Next slide. At about 4 a.m. on 1/9/2018, the debris flow occurred, and it was worse than anyone could have predicted. Despite specifically warning the utilities days earlier the threat of their high-pressure gas line, the first reported disaster was when the gas line exploded, burning 2 people and destroying homes. Next slide. The debris basins that have been cleared in preparation worked as designed in carpet debris. They saved lives. However, in Montecito, where a band of rain struck and dropped more than a half an inch of rain in 5 minutes, a 200-year storm event, the basins filled to capacity and overtopped, hurling millions of tons of debris consisting of rocks and mud and trees down toward a community where many had not evacuated. Survivors speak of the sound and smell as cars and homes were moved along with the mud and rocks. Next slide. Imagine the density of mud that can carry a rock the size of a van for more than a mile, and it was deadly. People were ripped from their homes and swept away, resulting in devastating loss of 23 members of this tight-knit community. A 2-year-old and a 17-year-old's bodies have never been found. More than 500 structures were destroyed or damaged, while Highway 101 was closed for nearly 2 weeks. Next slide. Millions of tons of mud and rock spilled out on roads and creeks, in homes and covered properties. This disaster was unique as mud does not recede like a normal flood. Next slide. It would take 13 days to reopen Highway 101, the second most important north-south highway in the state. Next slide. 800 rescues would occur. Families of the dead and missing were cared for at a family assistance center. 70 people stranded had to be evacuated by helicopter. Next slide. The utilities were obliterated. It would take 18 days to make the area safe enough for people to return home, those who had a home that escaped the damage and destruction. Next slide. Students had missed weeks of school during the fire and were now missing school because of the debris flow, and they would miss more every time we had another storm. So we met daily with school superintendents to strategize. Next slide. To open schools, we needed teachers who could not, along with other essential workers, get to work because they lived on the other side of the closed Highway 101. So we developed a 17-bus daily circuitous route to and from Santa Barbara through the mud-filled roads. Next slide. We had 20+ people assigned to our Joint Information Center trying to provide constant information. Next slide. CAL FIRE damage inspection teams created interactive maps of every structure in the debris field so evacuated people could learn if their homes were damaged or destroyed. Next slide. Restoration recovery was complex. We were already tired and had to approach it strategically. While we were doing recovery, we were simultaneously preparing for more storms that could trigger another debris flow. Next slide. We created branches so we could focus efforts. Debris, watershed, storm readiness, health and human services, reconstruction, infrastructure, and cost recovery branches. Next slide. Debris removal for public facilities, roads, and debris in basins and creeks was a $120 million effort and done by the Army Corps of Engineers. We had to get the debris basins cleared as fast because more storms would come and fill them again. Next slide. We deployed mental health therapists to the field and had them operate in the community for a year afterwards. There were memorials and one-year remembrances, creating hope and future in the community. Next slide. Volunteers were essential. They worked the call centers, water distribution points, and dug out homes. Significant financial donations were made. Next slide. To make decisions on evacuation and continue to abide by Unified Command, we established a storm risk decision team that would come together anytime a storm was predicted. We had established next slide. We had established evacuation principles that we posted in the conference room where we gathered. Quote, only evacuating them when necessary. Only evacuate those areas that are necessary and return people home as soon as possible. Next slide. We used interactive maps that showed the individual homes that needed to evacuate, so we were only evacuating those who were threatened. And finally, as the brush grows back, the threat diminishes, only to be repeated again. Next slide, I'm sorry. As the brush grows back and the threat diminishes, only to be repeated again here or somewhere else, the future is becoming clear for first responders and emergency managers. We are experiencing weather-induced disasters, fires, floods, heat emergencies, power outages, debris flows with a frequency we had not prepared for. Organizationally, we need to change our paradigm, and emotionally, we need to strengthen our determination. We are asking responders to have enduring physical and mental strength. We will be asked to step up more often, to look to the future for what could happen and what we could not imagine could happen. I thank you for your attention to this. Back to you, Reggie.
All right, thank you, Robert. That definitely was a disaster, multifaceted. Now I'd like to welcome Lieutenant Walter English from the city of Fairfax, Virginia, where he's emergency manager. Walter.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. I think what we just heard from Rob is wildfires are a very big incidents, and they're going to happen. We need to prepare. So as we look, as Ranger said, my background, I am an emergency manager in the National Capital Region of Washington, D.C. So as we look at preparedness and fire risk, we have a lot of what we run our country with. All three-letter organizations, the seat of the national government, everybody that makes that function. And one little wildfire, it could be somebody throwing a cigarette down the middle of the highway. That could literally stop our national government or even stop interstate commerce. So when we start to look at our resilience from community fire and wireland, it's how can we combat that so that we can do the best that we can to keep functioning within the National Capital Region. A little bit in this presentation, I'm just going to touch on some of our restoration priorities, a little bit of individual preparedness, and then just a little bit of the difference that you might see in the wireland versus what we might see from some of our partners in the West. A little bit on my background, as Ranger said earlier, he has a background in fire. I think we all do for this presentation. I started out as a firefighter in line, had my red card, did many wildland firefighters. I was on the IMT, got sent out west. The fires out west don't necessarily compare to what we have on the East Coast. What we have on the East Coast in size is a lot of times much smaller, but our damage seems to be about the same just because of some of our population density and then all wildland urban interface and that changeover going from wildland to new buildings as we expand. So as we can see up there, there's a little slide that says success is never an accidental journey. And the whole premise to that is what we go to look at is we're going to have success because we got there by training. We got there by working as a team. With climate change, we have seen that the fire risk is only going to increase. In a study from the National Capital Region that took place from about 1996 to about 2013, there was only an average of about 141 wildland fires that we considered, and they only burned an average of 6 to 8 acres per fire. In a study from 2013 on, it shows that there was tens of thousands of what they would consider wildfires and burned a whole lot more acres. And on average, they were burning around 100 acres per fire. Like I said, that doesn't necessarily compare to some of the stories that Rob or Ross might show. But when you start to look at how urban we are and how many concrete and cement and everything else, there's not that much greenland. So when we actually burn them, you're burning them a lot. And it's what it has the effect on, whether it's the power grid or transportation or us stopping interstate commerce. So the results of that are just incredible. How do we really want to build this resiliency? We really want to look at pre-disaster planning, and that is our way to success. So you want to know your threats. You want to know your limitations. Know what your issues are ahead of time. Are your issues evacuations? Where do people go? One of our major issues in the National Capital Region is that so many people rely on public transportation. And if public transportation goes down or they can't get it, how do you get them home? Many people now live 50, 60 miles sometimes even in a different state from where we work. Every day with rush hour in the National Capital Region, we're moving over 1 million people in and out of Washington, D.C., out to the suburbs. And they're relying on that public transportation. If we have a wildland fire and it shuts down the metro system, or we have smoke that's going over a highway and we shut that down, what do? Have you ever stopped a parent from trying to get to daycare to get their child? They will do incredible things to get there to get that child on time. And we have to be mindful of that. So our success is realizing that ahead of time, teaching our responders, teaching people, teaching how you can be resilient and be ready to recover from a wildfire. And that's individual preparedness, community preparedness, even your facility preparedness. And just know who your partners are and kind of what role they play and what you expect of them. Next slide. So when we start to talk about preparedness and restoration, we're going to dive into that just a little bit more. So you have to know what your goal is. Is your goal that you're going to try to restore and get back to a new normal, or do you want to do it in steps? What does full restoration look like? That's kind of the conversation that you need to have with your team ahead of time. You know, Rob showed in his slides that they put together this team ahead of time that was their EOC manager, their city manager, department heads, the mayor. But those are some of those conversations that you need to have ahead of time. And what does this look like? And what do we expect that new normal to be? We've learned from many incidents in the past that folks have a very short memory and they only remember what recently happened or what affects them. And if it doesn't affect them, then they don't necessarily pay attention. So build off of that in your preparedness. If last year we had wildfires in the Midwest that were bringing smoke all the way to the East Coast. So we capitalized on that and said, hey, look, this is what's happening. Imagine if that happened here and you're already seeing the effects. You're coughing, you're sneezing, you see it in your house. We're telling you to shut your windows. And that's 5 and 6 states away. So build on that and try to get that community preparedness while you can. What are your restoration priorities? And then who makes those up? Who makes that decision? You have to kind of work as a group to figure that out. How do you test it, whatever system that is in that group of people? I know for us internally within the National Capital Region, we each have our own alert system. And within those own alert systems, we have our EOC teams or management teams built out, and we test those quarterly. So sometimes it could be simple as, hey, this is the test. Everybody show up. You have a quick conversation and you're gone. Because when we have to make those decisions, we need them. And then who gets to make them? There's always that question of authority. So we want to make sure that we have that. And then as we start to look at restoration, what is your communications plan? How do you alert your residents? How do your residents get alerted? What is that expectation? We know that alert signups are always very little. Most places are, I would say, 50 to 60%. There's never a high number. I think the highest you can see is really about 70% throughout the US. But how do you get that message out? Is it an alert system? Is it an EAS over TV? Communications is always what's going to make or break internally and externally. So people can only do what you expect them to do, and that's how they get that information. And we rely heavily on really alerting our residents so they know. Do you tell them about wildfires? Do they understand the threat and the risk? If you're not telling them what that threat is, when you send a message out that there's a wildfire and they need to evacuate, they're not going to take it seriously because they don't believe that it affects them. And that's what we see. So make sure that you send something that's actionable and then deliberate. And that bullet up there is people will respond to messages that have action. If it's just for information only, then don't waste your time. Give people action and tell them what you need them to do. Lastly, we're going to look at this population safety and support. What's your evacuation plan? What are your priorities? Have that done ahead of time, and that goes into preparedness and restoration. If you're going to break it down into east or west or different sections, know how your evacuation route can work and know your timing, because then when do you have to pull that trigger to start evacuating? Within the National Capital Region, we're moving 1 million people. We can't wait till the last minute and expect people to go, because it's just going to be gridlock and they're not going to go anywhere. So kind of know your timing and then how to do that. Next slide. Looking at preparedness and how these preparedness measures work. As an individual, things you want to look at: know several ways to leave your area, drive your evacuation routes, find your shelter locations, have a plan for pets, communications within your own family, within your own community, and then have you signed up for alerts or have you signed up to get notified? There's always the 6P principle, and that 6P principle in relation to evacuation: people and pets, papers, phone numbers, and important documents, prescriptions, vitamins, and eyeglasses, pictures and irreplaceable memorabilia, personal computers, and then plastic, whether that's the credit cards or cash. The kind of the 6 Ps. You want to have your go kit, have it ready to go, and then know what these items are. And that's what your responsibility is as an individual, so that you can take part when the authorities say, hey, this is what we need to do to recover or restore back to normal and get this evacuation going. As far as community preparedness, we want to start to look at, talk about wildfires, talk about them within your community, make it normal. A lot of times people don't think so. And I'm really speaking from our East Coast and the National Capital Region, because they don't happen so much. And when folks see them on the news, such as, things that happen in California, they're like, oh, this is a 14-day event and all wildfires here might be a day. So they're like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. Have it talked in the community, understand what that risk is, make it kind of normal. Spend time with your family discussing what a wildfire is. Understand the risk, know your risk, practice evacuation drills. If you're going to go out for a Sunday drive, drive your evacuation route, know your zones, stay informed, have your supplies ready. That's your community goal. That's what you want to do. You want to be an active participant and actively ready for really to recover and have this community resiliency be built. We're only as strong as we're weakest link. And then really as a community, avoid the smoke and fumes. Everybody always wants to go and look and go and see what it is. You don't have to. Watch the news. It'll be there. We kind of laugh and joke. It's like a moth to flames, but it's don't go and look, avoid it. And then use caution when we're turning to a burned area, whether that's your neighborhood, your home, whatever, just use caution. And then lastly, we look at a facility. And it goes along the same line. If you're a facility, know your risk, know what to do for your people, know how to get them out. Maybe you make the call early if you have one way in and out. As a facility, you're still responsible for your people and to your community. Do you have an internal, facility alert, a building? And these facilities could be whether it's an Army base or an office complex or an apartment complex or building. Anything that you just have a multiple area. What happens if you have a wildland fire on that facility? What is your responsibility? Do you have partnerships with surrounding agencies? A lot of it comes down to preparedness and then kind of what we do. Next slide. On this slide, you'll see a couple ideas of community preparedness and then outreach. Like I said, outreach is going to be our biggest friend. There's a couple successful ones that you can see on your screen. One with Red Cross and preparing a kit just for wildfires. Another one on the left, they did a virtual workshop, almost like a town hall where people could come and answer questions. And then on the right was, know your areas. You want 30 feet cleared around your house. And they kind of explain that. And they kind of go down like, hey, what is your defensible space? What do you need to do to take care of yourself in this instant? Because authorities might not be able to take care of an entire neighborhood. They're going to try to stop it. So kind of know that. Have these outreach campaigns and also visitors. In the National Capital Region, where, in the summertime, it's every school child that there is. And visitors don't necessarily know. So these outreach campaigns definitely get the word out for visitors and people coming. Next slide. All right, we're going to look at this road to, instead of recovery, we're going to just kind of call it restoration. What is our road to restoration? How do we get back to where we were before this happened? So one thing is, do you have a plan for re-entry? Who is responsible for re-entry? Do you have partners? If you're going to use your state guard to block off a certain area and you need to show an ID to get back in an area, who does that? How long does it take to get them in place? You have to understand what your re-entry procedures are ahead of time. If you don't have them, write them. In emergency management, there's no reason to recreate the wheel. Somebody else has them, they'll share them. I'll share you my re-entry procedures, but make sure you have them, because that needs to be done before the event happens. When you start looking at cleanup, what does cleanup look like? Do you want to restore power first? Do you want to get the roads first? Do you have high threat areas? Do you have buildings that need to be done? We look in the National Capital Region, Loudoun County, over 80% of all internet traffic comes through Loudoun County for the entire world, and really the US, so the US specifically. So when we look at that, some of our cleanup is, how do we get these buildings back? Like, what do we do around these buildings? How do we get these roads open? How do we get those people back? Because, we're not shutting down Amazon, like, we got to keep that stuff going. So that's just things you got to think about. How do you let people know how they can help? And that kind of goes to our communications. Everybody wants to take a role. When it affects the community, everybody will pull together. You'll see amazing resilience from communities when things like this happen, but they need to know what to do. This isn't like a flood where people are going to start donating clothes or things like that. If people are losing houses, they're going to go work in shelters. They're going to share some clothes, maybe some meals, pass out water, pass out N95s. Let folks where you need the help. Let them know what volunteers are. Part of them want to come and help just to get their mind off of a loss that they might have had from the wildfire. And then lastly, how do you communicate your plan out? How do you let your folks know? So as this starts to happen, the community can only fail to the level of expectations you set. So as an emergency manager, as a fire official, as a leader, as an authority, you want to let folks know what your plan is, what their role is, and then, exercise that during the event. If you do your news conferences, this is what we need you to do, evacuate, stay away, check on your family, have that authoritative voice and definitely let folks know what they need to do. This road to restoration happens before the event happens. And that all comes down to planning, having your plan done, and then sharing your plan. And you might have heard there's all this adage, a plan is nothing, but the planning process is everything. And then next slide. That should be it. So just to wrap up really quick, like I said, it's all in the plan and then your process. And then the fire risk is growing and we just need to stay on top of it. But that's it. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to you, Ranger.
All right, thank you, Walter. Before we go to our next presenter, I do want to remind folks that we do want your feedback in one of two ways. You can either put something into chat and we will answer it or pass it along directly. Also, you can put it into questions and there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentations here. So please put those into questions and or chat and we will capture them. What I'd like to do now is introduce Mr. Ross Holloway. He's a managing partner with Utility Response Training Associates. And in 2020, he was the Northwest MAC Group representative for the Oregon Department of Forestry for the devastating fire.
Sounds like maybe we just lost Ranger's voice there. Ranger, are you back?
We did lose Ranger, but I can pick it
Ross?
up if you want, John.
Ross,
Okay, sorry,
you're up, my friend. Here we go.
Okay. Okay. Well, you cut my introduction off a little short there, but that's okay. It's still morning on the west coast of America, so I'll say good morning and welcome everybody. My name's Ross Holloway. And as Ranger said, I do some work. I did some work for the Oregon Department of Forestry. I had a career there and then still go back and work for them occasionally. So this morning I was going to share with you a little of Oregon's experience with catastrophic fire and also, recovering and restoring after fire. And for context, I might also share a little bit about kind of the history of large fires in Oregon and some of the trends we're seeing and the implications for creating fire resilient communities. As I get started, I do want to acknowledge the Oregon Department of Forestry. They provided me some great data and information for what I'm going to present today, and also some photos of the 2020 fires that we had here. And the Oregon Department of Emergency Management is another agency that was very helpful in providing me photos and some other information. So first of all, as I get started, if I could do a poll, I would ask all of you share a few words that come to mind when you think about Oregon. And my guess is fire would probably not be on the top of very many people's lists. So let's take a look at the next slide and see what Oregon is known for. And maybe you've heard about the Oregon coast. You might have visited beautiful beaches, or you might have visited the Columbia River, driven a highway on one side or the other of that. That's our northern border. Across the river is the state of Washington. Or if you're a fan of national parks, you may have experienced Crater Lake National Park or seen photos of it. And then, of course, Portland is our largest city, and that's Mount Hood in the background there, which lies at the confluence of the Columbia River and the second largest river in the state, the Willamette. So common theme, all that is water, right? And if we look at the next slide, water has created probably what Oregon is known for the most, and that is its forests, dense pretty green forest in most parts of the state, and plenty of rain. There's areas in the Coast Range between the Pacific Ocean and the Willamette Valley that get 100 or more inches a year. So it's essentially a coastal rainforest. And really water in one form or another, either lack of it or great quantities of it, pretty much defines our forests and our vegetation types. And that in turn defines, how we experience fire. We'll move on. We'll look at another thing that Oregon is known for. If you're a history buff, and particularly if you are familiar with fire history, you may be aware that in the 1930s and 40s, Oregon had several very large fires west of Portland. Collectively, they were known as the Tillamook burn. They were actually 3 separate large fires, 6 years apart, each of which burned between 200 and 300,000 acres. And we're talking burning essentially coastal old growth forests, so extreme fuel loadings, extreme fire behavior. Prior to the Tillamook fires, there really wasn't a very effective fire protection system in Oregon for wildland fires. And that the result of the Tillamook fires was the establishment really of the modern day firefighting system, which of course had a goal of suppressing all fires. And so we'll see, as we get into other slides here, how that affected things. So the next slide is a little busy. I want to focus on a couple things in it. And it's essentially a fire history for about 110 years. So if you go to the far left, we're back in 1910, 1911, which is really when firefighting started in Oregon, at least, post-European settlement. And you can see the trend line there, lots of large fires back in the early part of the 20th century. And that coincided, and you probably can't see it very clearly, but the bottom of this graph is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is the oscillation in Pacific temperatures that really drives weather on the West Coast and drives our warm and our cool cycles. And that was during a pretty warm cycle that occurred. So warmer, drier along the West Coast, particularly in the Northwest. And then you can see how things leveled out. And a period of many decades there, fire suppression system was pretty effective. And we had some cooler cycles in the Pacific Oscillation, which helped dampen the fire seasons a little bit. So that white line is the number of fires, and you can see that stays fairly consistent over time. Little peaks here and there, but the dark red line is the acres burned, and it drops down quite low for many decades. But starting just in the last few decades, that line starts to rise again, and then we'll talk about 2020 here in just a minute. But things really peaked last year with a pretty extreme fire season. So, of course, that fire suppression that went on all those decades, in many parts of this state, what happened is we had increasing fuel loads in our forests that historically probably burned every 20 to 30 years. Hadn't burned in close to 100 years. So if we move to the next slide, we'll see take a little closer look at the last 3 decades of fire. And this graphic, from the upper left to the lower right, runs from a 10-year period in 1991 to 2000, and then the last one on the lower right is the 10-year period from 2011 to 2020. And the red, dark red on those maps is acres of fires. And so you can see that first decade, 30 years ago to 20 years ago, we had large fires, about 1.7 million acres of them in a 10-year period. But the next decade, that doubled to over 3 million acres. And you can see the larger red spots. And then the most recent decade doubled again. So approaching 7 million acres burned in the period 2011 to 2020. So that, as you can see, we're on a trend upwards, and you're looking at 30 years that I spent on incident management teams in this state. So it got busier and busier and busier as the years went on. So let's take a closer look at 2020, and that was a record fire season. So on the next slide, you'll see the fires that occurred primarily on Labor Day weekend, and it was just the very tail end of Labor Day weekend that these happened. The most severe fire season in Oregon's recorded history. And probably what's even more remarkable about it is these fires burned 1.3 million acres, and probably the majority of that acreage was in a 48-hour period that started on Monday evening, September 7th. And the trigger was a historic east wind event, which is an offshore flow here from the east to the west, warming and drying as it subsides. Probably really similar to the event that happened when the Tillamook Fires burned back in the 30s and 40s. But it was a very unusual east wind event for us in the time of year. We often get those kinds of east wind events late in the fall or in the early winter when we've already had some moisture. But this time we'd had none. And so when it was all over, we had many homes lost, commercial buildings, and other structures, and lots of evacuations. And so let's move on. And like I said, a good deal of that acreage was consumed in 48 hours, but a big run occurred in about a 12-hour period overnight on September 7th and 8th. 80-mile-an-hour winds, and they basically funnel down the river canyons that are aligned from the east to the west down into the Willamette Valley in the northern part of the state. The metropolitan areas of Portland and Salem and Eugene all lay pretty much due west of paths of these fires. There were 3 large fires in 3 separate canyons. And evacuations, started late at night, 10, 11 o'clock, and went on through the night in those river canyons and did continue on for the next several days. We'll move on to the next slide. And we'll see what a satellite photo showed of Western Oregon on Tuesday, September 8th. And so all that green is from the Cascades, to the Pacific. And you can see that the 2 or 3 or 4 of the largest fires there completely covered. I mean, it was basically like evening all day on Western Oregon. So fortunately on Wednesday, September 9th, those east winds finally did diminish. And by the next morning, we had a turnaround to our normal onshore flow that occurs, and the fire behavior dropped significantly. But the damage had been done. If we go to the next few slides, we'll go through those and see some of the things that occurred. And so this photo was taken up the Santiam Canyon east of Salem, near the small town of Detroit, Oregon. And they lost fire apparatus as well as a number of commercial structures and a number of residences as well. And if we move on, we'll see some destruction that occurred on another fire. Overall, there were over 4,000 homes lost. And there's been some large fires in California that there were a lot more than that, but this is unprecedented for the state of Oregon to have that many homes destroyed in a fire event over a couple-day period. And 9 lives were lost. And then this shows some of the recreation infrastructure that was damaged and roads that were closed. And this event happened at about 9 p.m., started at about 9 p.m. on Monday of Labor Day weekend. We really, even though there's tremendous damage, we dodged the bullet. There were probably tens of thousands of people recreated in those river canyons the day before and the 3 or 4 days prior. And so the loss of life would have been dramatically higher if that event had occurred 2 or 3 days earlier while all those folks were in the canyon. As it is, the long-term impacts of the burned areas is going to be huge. The other thing was impacted was fire protection infrastructure and offices of some of our fire protection partners. So this shows a guard station. That's actually an Oregon Department of Forestry guard station in the winter, and your photo on the lower right shows it on September 9th. So yeah, even our own equipment and buildings were consumed on one of our offices, and several firefighters and volunteer firefighters had their homes burned, and they still responded. They still worked for days to respond to this. So historic fires, unprecedented for Oregon. Will we see something like that again? If we look at the next slide, we'll see kind of where we're headed in the current fire season. This is the Drought Monitor, the U.S. Drought Monitor for the state of Oregon, and basically showing that almost the entire state is in dry, or is in some form of drought, from moderate up to exceptional drought in portions of south central Oregon. And so it's not encouraging. Fire season has already started here. There's already been several large fires, nothing on the scale of 2020, but we're 4 to 6 weeks earlier probably than a typical year in terms of burning conditions. We did get a little reprieve in the west part of the state with some rain over the weekend, but forecast now is hot and dry. So we'll close out with a few slides talking about restoration. And when we talk about restoration in Oregon, we're really talking about dealing with unnatural forest conditions. And in trying to create more fire resilient communities, you know, a big part of it is dealing with the challenges. So we have an expanding wildland urban interface in this state. It's been expanding for many decades. So more homes being built in fire prone areas. I mentioned the fuel loads have increased because of a century of fire suppression efforts. And we're seeing extreme fire conditions become more prevalent, particularly in Western Oregon, where the majority of our population resides. So, you know, there's public resistance to some of the mitigation measures that are needed to address the fuels, opposition to logging, the visual and health impacts of smoke from using prescribed fire to try to restore fire resilient forests, and clearing fields around homes. You know, people like to have brush and trees around their homes for privacy. So, you know, there's been some land use planning in place to try to help the situation, but there's resistance to increasing those as well. And so, and just an overall lack of incentives for fireproofing structures. But let's look at some of the opportunities, because there are some, and that's on the next slide. And so some of the opportunities we do have is there is increased awareness because of some of the fires we've now had on the west side of the state. We do have a kind of a classic urban-rural divide in Oregon. And some of the urban residents got a taste of what rural Oregon has been dealing with for a long time. And that's occasional fires threatening their communities. So that's raised awareness a lot. All the way to the coast, we had coastal communities threatened by fire in September that hasn't happened for many decades. So there are effective programs going on, and they are successful. They just need to be scaled up. Part of that is making them economically feasible, the fuel reduction that's needed to go into areas and reduce the fuels. And the air quality regulations are pretty strict in Oregon. And some have been relaxed, though, and have been relaxed specifically to allow for more prescribed burning. So in the end, I think community wildfire protection planning, Walter mentioned planning. I think that is the key to it. Local groups have been very active in Oregon, and that needs to expand into additional communities as we've seen fire expand and impact additional communities. And so restoration is a big part of what we're going through right now in Oregon, and it's a community effort. And I think the community groups that Walter mentioned, and I would echo that, know who your team is, get them working now, ready for the threat of fire or the threat of other disasters and how they're going to recover. And it's a team sport. So know who your team's going to be and work ahead of time. You'll be much more effective when the hard times hit. All right, I'll wrap it up there and turn it back over to Ranger. And I think we're going to have some questions perhaps.
Yes, we are going to have some questions. What I'd like is for all the presenters to please turn your cameras on and be ready to answer some questions. While you're doing that, there's some key takeaways that I noticed in here. With Robert, the long-term impacts, especially on the community, were evident as far as that event. And I think you'll find the same in large disasters around the country that are related to our large wildfires. Public perception was also a key point, takeaway that I noticed there. And if anybody doesn't know where Montecito is, I'm sure you've seen it on the news. Oprah lives there, and there's a certain prince who left England and is now residing there as opposed to England. Those are some real key issues for a number of us around the country if we're dealing with something like this. For Walter, I noticed you mentioned the signups and the challenges there, and you have 1 million people to move. The more people that aren't signed up, that's the harder it is to get that message out. I heard Go Kit and what should be in it. I think anybody listening, hopefully you paid attention to that. And also planning and sharing. I think that is a key takeaway. Working with your cooperators in the National Capital Region, we are sure hoping that they're effective in their cooperation because that impacts the whole country. For Ross, there's a number of communities that really took a hit during those fires, and the getting them to come back, I think, is one of those real keys. You mentioned history and history repeating. As we took a look at that, way back we burned it, and now it burned again. And if it's green, I have a feeling it may burn again in the future unless we're very effective. The fuel loading also was a key, how that changed over time. There are a number of questions that we've received, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw some of these out there, and I'll send them to a person by person to begin with, and some of them are for all of you, but after I throw them to the person they were directed to, then I will go ahead and open it up for the rest of you to go ahead and speak. So Robert, there was a mention of evacuation fatigue, getting the people to leave. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So as anybody that's done evacuations, whether that's for hurricanes or any kind of an event, hazardous, there is a, first of all, suspect when the government asks you to leave. People immediately will look for validation, even though we've sent them a government alert and we've told them in varieties of ways. The first thing they're going to do is an extreme example, call their brother-in-law who happens to be a firefighter in another town and see if they should actually leave, which is something that we're all combating. But in the particular case of our disasters in Santa Barbara County, people were evacuated for weeks because of the fire. Now they understand fire because it's part of their muscle memory in California, but to be evacuated then for a storm on a blue sky day really was something that they just weren't responding to. And we had very low response to our evacuations, and they were frankly just tired. They've been gone for weeks already from their homes, and now we were asking them to go again. And then after the debris flow, we were asking them to go another 6 times because of the potential for more debris flows over the next 2 years. We've got to do a better job about messaging. We need to standardize our terminology in evacuations. We even have conflicts within families. A husband may not want to evacuate and a wife might want to evacuate, or vice versa. And now you have these internal conflicts going on. So there's a whole psychology that we need to better understand.
All right, thank you. Ross or Walter, any thoughts on this subject?
Well, we had an interesting experience with evacuations, obviously, over the Labor Day weekend. I would say, in the normal situation, we're able to get the word out to folks. And when I say normal, a fire starts and maybe it grows for a day or two, and then a weather event comes along. So we have some time to prepare. What we saw Labor Day weekend was a fire event that just emerged almost out of nowhere overnight, and within hours, had several major fires moving towards populated areas. So it was much more difficult to notify, to get the people out. So it's still, even though I think we're well prepared for that kind of thing in Oregon, we weren't prepared for that one.
All right, thank you. And to tag on to that, Walter, what difficulties would you expect with the wildfire evacuation in your region?
I think it kind of just goes to what Robert just said a little bit with evacuation fatigue. I think for us, right now we're in the middle of hurricane season. And you have a couple day ramp up for that. So we can kind of start preparing, getting the messages out there. So by the time it's time to evacuate, people have heard the message a couple times. They're not really questioning it. With the wildfire, there's not that lead up time. It's kind of like, hey, this is what's happening. We need you to clear this part of the area now. And I think that's where they come in, is like, Is this real? Is it not? Who's the authority telling us to do this? So we don't have that ramp up time, and a lot of it's just a questioning and, you know, my job's more important, I can't leave, or I need to get, you know, I live 30 miles away and I need to get through here. This is the only way I know to get home. So those are some of the challenges that we start to face with the evacuation in the National Capital Region.
All right, thank you. Walter, I'd like to do a follow-up with you. One of the folks asked, can you recommend a resource that provides the 6 Ps when drilled down information and what should be included?
There are a lot of the 6 Ps will just come down to normal preparedness and then how to build a kit. A lot of it will just, it's individual preparedness for what is in your emergency kit. And we internally had started to use the 6 Ps because then we could build outreach on them. You know, like the last one is plastic, you know, but that's credit cards and cash. And so we just kind of started to develop the 6 Ps. It's out there. A lot of it is, we just pulled it from individual community preparedness. We just tried to find a different way to put them together. We believe in a lot of our outreach in schools and young children. We have multi-languages. If you can get to the children that can speak a lot of times more than one language, they can take it home where they might speak a whole different language when they're within their household. So we try to do things that are easy to remember, things that children might be able to take home, and that 6 Ps was just kind of reevaluating individual preparedness and emergency kits. But I'd be happy to, it's in my slides, and I know they'll be sharing the slides, and I'm definitely happy to share more later on.
All right, thank you, Walter. And I'll do a blatant plug for EarthX. We're going to be incorporating a lot of references on evacuations and planning as part of the additional information on EarthX. So there's our plug for EarthX. Robert or Ross, any other thoughts on that subject?
Well, I guess I'd make a plug here that we've got a standardized language in evacuation, frankly, across the United States, but I'd be happy just California that the term evacuation order or the term evacuation warning are used, and we no longer use mandatory and voluntary. The term voluntary is essentially a non-evacuation in the eyes of the people receiving that message. So we've got to standardize that across the country. I think the system that's been devised for wildfire, for Ready, Set, Go, has been amazingly understandable by the public. And I encourage my friends that work in hurricane country or storm areas to adopt the same language. We did that in Santa Barbara. We used Ready, Set, Go, and that was very effective for the following evacuations. And then finally, I think we need to standardize some of the National Weather Service warning language as well. It's different for each type of disaster, but coming up with a standard, the same way we've standardized in ICS, let's do that in the way we're approaching evacuation and alerting.
Yeah, I would just echo what Robert said about the Ready, Set, Go system. That's worked really well here in the Pacific Northwest for a number of years.
I understand. I was there at the initiation of Ready, Set, Go, and it was a takeoff of a failed policy, which was called Stay and Defend in Australia, that had some disastrous consequences, and we scrapped it and went with a different direction. I agree that's effective. All right, there are a couple other questions in here. For the Labor Day weekend fires and also the Tillamook fires, what was the point of ignition on those? Was it related to cooking or sparks, that type of thing, or what was it?
Yeah, so actually the Tillamook fires back in the 30s were human caused. We were basically logging operations at the time on the eastern fringes of that forest, and unfortunately the subsequent fires were salvage logging operations that occurred, and the fires burned through the snags from the earlier ones. 2020 was a little different situation. We had multiple ignition sources. We'd had lightning a few weeks before. There were some holdovers that erupted. One of the fires appears to have been an abandoned campfire from Labor Day weekend. And then there's a series of fires where down power lines are suspected as the cause. So it was a whole range of different ignition sources came together to create what ended up being 3 or 4 large fires, but the reality was multiple ignitions occurred and it just burned into one large fire in each canyon. So a variety of sources, natural and human caused.
All right, thank you. We have another question in here. Wondering if anybody has done any work on health impacts of these major incidents. both physical and mental health in relation to wildfires?
So this was a big issue, of course. It has been a big issue in California. First, from the first responder standpoint, we have a force, and I think Ross said this well as he laid out the history of the increase in fires. Of course, that's been going on everywhere in the West. That we're asking our first responders to just go and go and go. And now that's even affecting, of course, the others, the Emergency Operations Center folks. There's no downtime, and they're seeing things that, I mean, an old wildland firefighter, myself included, that in the early days, we kind of had a good time at fire camp. It was a time to see people and do our job, and we didn't have this constant structure protection, community protection issues. And now every fire seems to be tragic. I was on the Creek Fire assisting in the Emergency Operations Center in the fall, and it was just one, you know, you have people that are so impacted, their homes are destroyed, their lives are undone, economies are strained, and those impacts are really causing problems. So we've got, the solution really is immediately when the fires become this kind of destructive, we've got to move into restoration recovery. You have to start by getting those folks out in the field, your behavioral wellness, mental health folks, their teams together. So putting teams together now for any kind of emergency, having them meet monthly, quarterly, so that they know each other. So when you need these teams to go out and do it, and that includes providing debriefings to personnel, but also, as an example, in Santa Barbara County during the debris flow, we had public works employees finding the remains of people. And that is not something they ever signed up for. And those are things that are going to be experienced more and more.
All right, thank you. This one goes to all of the areas. The question of electric power, is it really ready to being able to deal with fire issues? Has it been fortified and or their vulnerabilities? And I'll just throw that out for any of the three of you.
Well, if I could jump in here, and I encourage people, I've written a couple articles just on this subject, but if we do a look back to the period Ross was talking about, I'm guessing the Tillamook, I have no idea, but that period and before that, from about 1870, 1860 to about 1930s, fires were caused by railroads predominantly. They were just big ignition sources. And through extreme regulation of the railroads, by clearing the tracks, by changing the fuel source from coal and wood to oil and other uses, that eliminated this incredible spark problem. And the railroads are not that, they don't cause that many fires anymore, but they were causing devastating fires. Well, that's the same thing we need to do with our public utilities, is we need to regulate them in a manner that alleviates this problem. The problem, of course, is when it's windy, that's when power lines drop. Well, that's also when fires grow. So that ignition source in itself, in California, it's about 9 or 10% of the fire ignitions are caused by power lines, and those are usually on bad. I think the top 5, don't hold me to this, of the worst fires, the largest fires in California recorded history were power line or electrical caused.
Yeah, and I would echo what Robert was saying there. We've got a hardening to do on our electrical system in this state. So
I understand, and I've done, as a number of us have, tours or training around the country, and the conditions that we see are kind of universal. There is fuel, there's electrical, there's people. The chances of fire exist all over the country and in many countries around the world, and I think the issues like drought, and if you introduced an East Coast drought into the U.S., you might find a very different fire climate. We know that this year is going to be a very different fire climate on the Western U.S. I apologize for any questions that we weren't able to get to. You will be receiving a copy of this presentation, and also a link to the recording for any of you that were interested there. We also ask that you pay attention to EarthX and our other opportunities to view our videos. This is a plug for EarthX. We really see this as a potential and a reality for a number of folks around the country. And we want to thank all of our presenters here today. They have a long-term vested interest in seeing things go well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and thank you all for attending.
Hey, thanks, Ranger, and to our panel, outstanding presentations, great information. There's a lot of give and take on the Q&A board, and we'll capture all that and get that out. I'd like to give a little bit of a plug for our next in our training series for EarthX, the Community Flooding Resilience Workshop, 15 July, same time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Sign up if you enjoyed this one. You're going to think this the one on flooding is very good, and we will follow flooding 1 month later with community resilience, and we're going to give you an entirely different look at resilience. We're going to take a look at it from the private sector standpoint and how an active private sector integration can really change the future going forward. And of course, that's about 2 weeks before EarthX will be released. Next up in our series for the EIS Council, as part of the Global Resilience Commission, is the kickoff of our Green Grid Security webinar series. You're going to want to be part of this. We've managed to find 4 international speakers, all very, very highly credentialed, that are going to break down the risks and the opportunities that come with moving towards a green grid solution, which we're all for, but we've got to make sure we do it in the smartest possible way and plan and prevent energy emergencies. So GRCOM next Wednesday at 11, there's the registration link. And as Ranger has mentioned, EarthX. This training series is part of the EarthX lead up. EarthX is coming together extremely well this year. We had over 41 countries play last year, over 12,000 participants. We want everybody to play this year. We hope you will help us get the word out and get more people to sign up. There's the registration link. Odds are most of you all have already registered, but it'll be available for play 1 September through 31 October. So again, we appreciate you making time for our session today, and look for the slides and the link to the video recording coming out as soon as the video renders, and we'll get that to you as soon as possible. I hope to see you on the GRCOM session next week, and then our flood webinar series lead up for EarthX in July. With that being said, thank you all for your participation. Again, thanks to our panelists. Just a great job, Ranger, Robert, Ross, and Walter. You set the bar high for those that are going to follow you. Everybody be safe, take care, and I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you all.